Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Despite the weight of evidence indicating a natural origin of COVID-19, the U.S. government won't let go of the conspiracy theory that the COVID-19 virus was leaked from a lab in China. The White House recently said it was deeply disappointed in China's decision to reject a proposal to have the WHO return to Wuhan, China for a second phase study. And China says it opposes politicization of the virus origin tracing, as it should be a scientific process. What is the progress made on COVID-19 origin tracing, and why is scientific work now so highly politicized? To talk about all this, I'm glad to be joined by Einar Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, and also by Dr. Ellen Whiteside, OBE, also chair of global health policy in the Center for International Governance Innovation, and by Wu Zhiwei, professor and director at the Center for Public Health Research in the Medical School of Nanjing University. Welcome, gentlemen. That is our topic. I'm Wang Guan. So, Dr. Wu, let me go to you. I know many people are wondering why are we still talking about this? I'm wondering that too. But what do we know about the origin of COVID-19 so far? What is the scientific evidence indicating regarding the origin of COVID?
But scientific evidence actually overwhelmingly indicating that it's likely coming from the animal or natural source. Actually, we do know that in the early stage, the pangolins were identified to carry the viral genes, and also other mammals as well. So this is something actually we know. I mean, one big issue here is that we are kind of, too pushy on terms of finding out the origin of the virus. We know that finding or identify to get a conclusive conclusion on where the virus came from, it's always a very difficult task. It takes years to get a clear answer. So I think we do need a patient that to basically to find out truly where the virus came from. This is a very scientific issue. We need to have an international cooperation and basically come down to exactly the accurate answer.
So, Dr. Whiteside, do you have anything to add? I mean, right now people are pushing for this lab leak theory again. How likely is it that COVID-19 originated from a lab in, say, Wuhan, China?
It's extremely unlikely. I totally agree with Dr. Wu. This is a zoonotic event where a disease has spread from animals to humankind. I think the origin, and I hope Dr. Wu would agree, would be bats. The intermediate species is pangolins, and I don't think there's much debate about this. This desire to have laboratory investigations is a pure distraction from dealing with the pandemic, which is what we should be focusing on.
Well, Einar, we've heard from the scientists, and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, is meeting WHO officials. The Biden administration is pushing for another round of what they call phase 2 investigation into this lab leak theory. Your thoughts?
Well, this is, from the political side, it seems it's just a way of deflecting blame for the very, very poor performance and in some cases almost criminal performance of governments in terms of dealing with the COVID-19 spread. I mean, they weren't surprised. They knew about it. The Chinese government told them about it. And yet what you saw was complete lack of preparation that has resulted in millions of lives being lost. In some countries, you can understand it because they don't have the kind of medical infrastructure that can deal with this. But in the United States and Europe, it's appalling that they did not do more to do this. So rather than take responsibility, which would mean the end of their political careers, you see this kind of mob rush to blame somebody else and create this theory that it's there. And I just want to add one thing. I know I'm not a scientist, but quite frankly, this, they keep talking about gain of function. All right. Well, the closest genetic match to this is 96%. So what that means is if you have 100, it has 96% of the same kind of genome that the human virus has, and that's from the bat. But what you see there is that if you look at the sequences themselves, it's not blocks of sequences that have been changed, which would happen if you're introducing and splicing in another virus. you would see changes in specific areas where it would have this gain of function. It is almost random in there. So this idea that it's possible, that's why the scientists have said categorically this was not some sort of lab experiment gone wrong. This was something they're looking at the zoonotic angle on this, and the rest is just politics.
Well, Dr. Wu, you said that to have a conclusive research study on the origin of COVID, it may take years. Why is it? What are the sticking points? What are the things that prevents us from reaching a conclusive conclusion?
Well, just because the virus it mutated, and also evolution force drive the virus to mutate it. So basically, when the virus goes through a very different host, it's going to change, and also it's very hard to pin down where exactly how the virus goes from one animal to the other animals. So this actually, we know that for the other viruses, we're trying to find its origins. It takes many years to understand and get a more kind of convincing evidence. For example, the HIV virus, its host is rather limited and much narrower than the coronavirus. But basically, the virus, HIV virus was identified 40 years ago. So far, we don't know exactly where the virus came from, where the origin is. I mean, this is something actually we have to bear in mind that this is a purely scientific issue. It takes many, many years actually to figure it out.
Einar, there has been a shift in WHO's attitude towards a second round of investigation. Previously, the chief of WHO said, enough is enough. China cooperated with WHO on round one of investigation. And now it says somehow a round two investigation into a lab leak theory in Wuhan is necessary.
Well, he's under tremendous financial pressure. Remember, the countries that are pushing him to do the second round are also the ones who provide his money. So he's not in a position where he can just say, look, the science is very clear. When you have all of these nations, Europe and America, saying, look, we want this and we need it for political considerations, can you rule it out? And he has to say, no, I can't rule it out. I can't also rule out that aliens are abducting cows and people and anally probing them. But it's not very likely. So, I mean, this is the thing. So when you start going at science with a political agenda, you're going to wind up with a mess. That's why we are in the situation we are with COVID in the first place.
So, Dr. Wu, this is not the first time that human beings are facing a coronavirus. We've seen multiple coronaviruses and its variants before. Why didn't we see similar type of politicization back then? Regarding other epidemics or pandemics originating in the Middle East from Africa. We don't hear Washington, insist that there be another round of investigation.
Well, I think at least two major factors contributing to the current situation. One is that the COVID-19 itself is tremendously impacting global infection. It's a huge pandemic which interrupt or disrupt the global normal life, and also cause the tremendous economic loss as well. The other thing is that as the geopolitical balance shifted, the U.S. actually finding this is a very critical and useful tool to basically launch an international smear campaign. I think those are the two major factors. Look at all the previous coronavirus infections, including the year 2003's SARS and later on the MERS cough. They're all very small scale epidemic and very limited. So its impact is just very limited. And usually those epidemic quickly under control. So I think this is a very different situation right now.
Dr. Whiteside, how do you look at this? What many believe to be politicization of the COVID origin around the world. It seems like COVID, which was supposed to be a moment that unites countries around the world, is dividing us.
I hope not. I think you could be right, but I do hope not. I think we have to recognize that this is a uniquely political disease. What we also need to know is that it has disrupted global life completely. If you're following the Olympics, we have a pathetically small audience. If you're trying to travel, as I did, I sat on a Dreamliner from London to Toronto with 19 passengers on board. Our lives have been totally disrupted by this disease. And one of the reactions when lives are disrupted is to look for reasons and look for people to blame. In soccer, there's an expression, play the man, not the ball. And I suspect that this is what is happening with some sectors of society. And let's be clear, it's not all. Some sectors of society are playing the man, which in this case is China, not the ball, which is COVID.
Yeah, fortunately, we still see some new Olympic or even world record being smashed in the pools in Tokyo Olympics and hopefully in field and track soon. Einar, how do you think the narrative of this COVID-19 pandemic will be written in the United States and across the Western world, considering that there will be a midterm election in 2 years and general election in 4 years, and people on the right are attacking Biden at every turn?
Yeah, I think if you start looking at it historically, it's not going to be very kind to Europe and the United States, because for the very reasons we discussed. They had forewarning, they did not take the proper precautions. You had people who were dismissing it, saying it wasn't there, or it would go away by Easter or something like this. And not only in the United States, you had it in Brazil, you had it in many other countries around the world where people were just trying to poo-poo the idea. And it was purely for political. But what you're going to see is the combination of the poor performance on COVID and also the economic after effects are going to see a lot of the governments who were in control during COVID removed. It's not clear who comes in after them, but obviously the people who vote are going to blame them for whatever it was, right or wrong. These are, if you look historically, these are the things that happen. The U.S. is trying to dominate the history, to literally rewrite it and somehow say it's all China's fault. But the issue is not getting to the truth. For instance, Ebola, they still don't know where it's come from. That's been around since the 1970s. They don't know the origin of it, despite the fact that it comes in and out sporadically. We may never know where COVID-2 came from. But at the end of the day, it's what you do about it that counts. And right now, if there was another pandemic in the world, can you imagine what would happen? You'd have Republicans in the U.S. saying this is, another frame job by China. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. There's always going to be another excuse.
Yeah. Conspiracy theories are abound. We'll take a break, gentlemen, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Dialogue. Dr. Wu, let me go back to you. There are now, clues indicating that this coronavirus already existed, or probably could have existed in other parts of the world by the end of 2019. That was the date of first reported case in Wuhan, China. Why does the U.S. show little interest in investigating those countries? I mean, how likely is it that COVID-19 may have originated in more than one location around the world?
Well, I just said earlier that the investigation of the COVID-19 origin essentially was raised by U.S. politicians and driven by a bunch of politicians too. And it doesn't have much scientific backup either. One of the issues here is that those cases which are identified both in the U.S. and in Europe, but the early cases of COVID-19 were first very small scale. The second is that they do provide clues that the pandemic may actually, or the virus may exist actually before the end of year 2019. I think it's critical. See, if we truly trying to find the origin of the virus, then we need to simultaneously look at those cases and conduct thorough scientific research and see where it is truly coming from.
Dr. Whiteside, what do you think about the theory that COVID-19 may have originated from multiple locations across the world?
I think that's quite unlikely. I think it originated in bats, in China, crossed into pangolins, crossed into humankind. And generally with most of the zoonotic diseases, it'll occur in one species and cross over. But there has to be a coalescence of events that allow the virus to mutate. And I'd love Dr. Wu to comment on that. For example, But the other thing which I would say is, yes, we always seem to find earlier cases after an outbreak, and HIV is no exception. When we identified HIV back in the 1970s, we were then able to track back and find very, very much earlier cases. For example, a missionary from Denmark, a sailor in Manchester, etc. So it's not unusual to find early outlier cases of a new disease, but it has to take hold in a population and ignite and cause an epidemic and then a pandemic.
You know, either the Chinese government is saying that there should be an investigation into the Fort Detrick, a U.S. military base, because there were, interesting activities over there that may suggest that there were dangerous operations, and somehow COVID may have originated from that U.S. military base. China doesn't know for sure, but it wants to find out. What do you think of that?
Well, I would look. I mean, the same things that the U.S. is saying about Wuhan, you could apply to Fort Detrick. There was an elderly home of people who suddenly got respiratory diseases. There were people who had respiratory syndromes that would be consistent with SARS. There has not been a lot of information, but I don't know that any of this is really very useful. I would agree with a doctor on this when he says, look, collect as much information as you can from all sources, whether it's in Wuhan or before, so that you get a genetic family tree of what is out there, because that's the best that you can do. You may not get to patient zero, you may not get to the origin, but remember, origin and manifestation are often two very different things. For instance, everyone says the Spanish flu. The one thing that all scientists agree, it did not originate in Spain, but that was the manifestation. Also in the US, more recently with swine flu. It originated somewhere else, but it manifested first in Mexico, but for individuals who are going back and forth across the border. So, really, the amount of time and effort that should be spent here, yes, trying to find the origin in terms of the crossover for scientific purposes, but right now it should be about getting the rest of the world vaccinated and taking care of the things and putting in place those protocols necessary to prevent this from being a pandemic again.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to move on a little bit and talk about the Delta variant that is, fast spreading from England to Indonesia, from Australia to Bangladesh. Dr. Whiteside, let me stay with you. Why is the Delta variant so, infectious that really accounts for much of the new case counts in the United States and across Europe?
Well, the Alpha variant was 60% more infective than the first coronavirus that crossed into human beings, and the Delta variant is in turn 60% more infectious than the Alpha variant. So we're seeing a ramping up in infectiousness, but I think Dr. Wu is far better able to answer the reasons why than I am.
Dr. Wu, seems like a question for you.
Because the viruses are always changing and always adapting to the environment. So basically, if you do not stop the pandemic, then the virus will keep changing and basically trying to survive in the new environment. That's what we saw with the Delta variant. I mean, as you vaccinate the people, but do not stop the virus from circulating, then I would expect the virus will keep changing and becoming more infectious or contagious. Although the other thing, actually, we have to look at it, this is a pandemic, and if you look at the vaccination rates around the world, in developed countries, there are much higher vaccination rates than the developing countries. In part of the South Africa, in part of the African countries, you do see that only less than 10%. Even some of them only 1 or 2% of vaccination rates. So that kind of imbalance causes the problem is that the virus will never be stopped in the situation like this. So that's why the COVAX program is very critical to distribute the needed vaccines to those countries. And then, if we cooperate, then we would be able to stop the pandemic.
So, Dr. Wu, will the new variants, for example, the Delta variant, render the vaccines irrelevant or at least less effective?
Well, actually, we only have rather limited information right now. We do have information that the Delta variants are a little bit more resistant than the current vaccines, and basically that makes current vaccines protection efficacy reduced. But it's not very clear, what, this reduction actually what that means to the overall pandemic. I think this is something that actually we have to bear in mind, that we shouldn't purely rely on the vaccination and vaccine right now. We need to still adapt to certain social distancing policies to prevent the pandemic.
Okay, Einar, it looks like we'll have to cope with the COVID and its variants for a long time. How long do you think this may last? And restricted travels, regulations on wearing a mask, and less individual liberty in that regard?
Well, quite frankly, probably till 2024, until you get to herd immunity on a global level. What we have seen from the vaccines is that although they're more transmissible, it seems so far that if you do have any one of the vaccines, it prevents serious hospitalization and also death. In the United States, you'll notice that 95% of the people who are getting the new variant of COVID are, in essence, people who did not get vaccinated, and 99% of the people dying are from there. So this is the key, to get the vaccines out there and as quickly as possible, because as the doctor said, the longer you keep it out, the more variants that you will get. Now notice, although these variants came from different countries, including Great Britain and India and things like, no one is talking in South Africa, no one is talking about those variants. We've gone to alphabet. Why? Because it doesn't matter where they come from, all right? It matters what we do about it.
Dr. Whiteside, when you talk about global vaccine distribution, it is apparently unequal. Richer countries are possessing large chunks of global vaccines. Do you see that as a problem? And really, how can we deal with that?
I think there are two parts to your question. One is, are vaccines being fairly distributed? And the answer is fundamentally no. The British have now, for the first time, started delivering donated vaccines to other countries, but that's a real issue. But I think we also need to remind ourselves that once we have the vaccines available in developed countries, the health systems in those countries are not necessarily equipped to deliver vaccines. And then there are complexities which we see particularly in, say, Afghanistan, where people are vaccine hesitant. I mean, it's not just in the US where you've got anti-vaxxers, you've got it in other parts of the world. So there are three challenges. One, getting enough vaccines. Yes, we can do that. Two, health systems in the developing world, they're not up to scratch. And three, vaccine hesitancy.
Einar, we have 1 minute left. Your final thoughts on this whole thing about COVID origin tracing, which seems to be an issue that will dominate Western headlines.
It's a smokescreen for incompetency at this point. The doctors have made it very succinct. We have problems. The big problem is, as he said, getting enough vaccine to the rest of the world, getting over the hesitancy and making sure that it's able to be delivered. The rest of this is just literally people trying to save their own political necks at the expense and using it opportunistically against China, who they want to suppress.
All right, Einar Tengen, current affairs commentator. Thank you, Dr. Wu Zhiwei from Nanjing University, and Dr. Ellen Whiteside, OBE and Chair of Global Health Policy in the Center for International Governance Innovation. And that would do it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.